Before, there were 7 kingdoms. Before there was a throne made of 1,000 swords, or a crown to fight over. There was only a continent, vast, green, and already inhabited, and the people who kept arriving on its shores. Certain they were the first to matter. They were never the first. They were only ever the latest. No record says exactly when the first men crossed over. There was no Westeros yet to write it down. Only a land bridge in the far north, and a people willing to walk across it into the unknown, carrying bronze weapons and herds, and the belief that empty land was theirs for the taking. The land was not empty. It belonged, as much as any land can belong to anyone, to a people already old beyond memory. Small, quiet, bound to the earth in a way the first men had no name for. They did not build halls or forge metal. They carved faces into trees and listened to a world the newcomers hadn't yet learned to hear. The first men called them the children of the forest, and for a long, bitter age they were less neighbors than obstacles, something to clear, the way a field is cleared before a plow. So, the first men burned the weirwoods, and the children answered in the only language 2 peoples share when neither one is listening. They fought back, calling on old magic and older grievances, and for a generation the forests of Westeros ran red. Neither side won. That was the lesson buried inside all that bloodshed, that neither people could simply erase the other, and that the land was large enough, if barely, to hold them both. Before we begin, subscribe to Historian for cinematic world history, told with depth, clarity, and power. When this episode ends, tell us in the comments which ancient or medieval world you want us to uncover next. And so, tradition holds on an island in a quiet lake. Something rarer than a victory was reached. A peace. The first men laid down their axes. The children spared what remained of the wood. It said the terms were carved into no scroll, sworn to no god by name, only witnessed by the old faces in the trees, and kept, more or less, for 4,000 years. You cannot own what was never yours to take, one elder is remembered, imperfectly, generations later, to have told the men across the fire. Then, teach us how to share it, came the answer. Whether those words were ever truly spoken, no one now can say. But the peace that followed was real enough to last longer than most kingdoms ever do. A world took shape in the centuries after the pact, scattered, stubborn, unranked. No single king, no single faith. Dozens of petty realms bound only by rivers and mountains, and the memory of a war neither side wanted to repeat. It was not yet a nation. It was barely a peace, and nothing in that fragile, divided world was prepared for what came next. No one agrees on when it began, only that it began in the north, in the farthest, coldest reaches of the continent, and that whatever it was, it did not knock. The first men called them the White Walkers. Later ages would argue about how much of what survived was memory and how much was nightmare reshaped by retelling. The Citadel's Meisters, centuries afterward, debated whether the Long Night was truly a war against the dead, or a folk memory of a generations-long winter, exaggerated into monsters by people desperate to explain why the sun would not return. But the first men who lived through it did not have the luxury of that debate. They only had the dark and what walked in it, and the dead who did not stay dead. For once, uniting was survival. The people who had burned the children's forests and the children who had cursed them for it found themselves fighting side by side against something that made no distinction between the two. Because to whatever moved through that endless winter, first men and children of the forest were simply the same thing. Alive, and therefore next. The stories that survive that war are fragments, a desperate stand at a river no one can now name with confidence, a night so long children were born and grew old within it, so it was said, though almost certainly no one truly believed that literally, even then. What the record agrees on is what came after. A wall. Not a wall of stone alone, a wall of purpose. Tradition credits its raising to a first man remembered as Bran the Builder. Though, what part of that towering feat was one man's work and what part was myth grown taller with every retelling, no one now can separate with certainty. What matters is that something, 700 feet of ice and will, stretching further than any living person could walk in a day, was built to answer a war that no ordinary wall should have been able to win. And behind it rose an order, sworn to watch it forever. Men who gave up crowns, families, and futures to stand on a wall at the edge of the world, so that everyone south of it never had to think about what was north of it again. The long night ended. No record says precisely how. Only that morning came, eventually, the way it always eventually does. And for thousands of years, the peoples of Westeros lived in the long, uneasy peace that followed. Divided still, ruled by dozens of petty kings descended from the first men, but no longer alone in the dark. Once, the realm had faced an enemy that any wall could hold back. What came next could not be stopped by any wall at all. They arrived the way every threat to Westeros ever had, by sea. But the Andals did not come as refugees, the way the first men once had, wandering into an empty land. They came as conquerors who believed the land was already theirs by right, carrying iron where the first men still carried bronze, and a faith, the faith of the seven, one god with 7 faces, that named the old gods of tree and root and river as nothing at all. Kingdom by kingdom, the old order broke. Iron cut through bronze the way bronze had once cut through nothing, because nothing had opposed it. Weirwoods that had stood since the pact were felled to clear ground for new septs built directly over the old worship. 6 of the first men's kingdoms fell, one after another, to Andal swords and Andal gods, their bloodlines absorbed, unseated or erased, remade into something that called itself Andal now, whatever it had been before. Only the North refused to fall. Whether by the harshness of its winters, the size of its distances, or simply the stubbornness of a people who had already survived the end of the world once and were not inclined to bow to the second thing that came for them, the North held. The old gods kept their faces in the trees there. The old blood kept its names. What was left, when the dust settled and the last Andal banner was planted, was not one Westeros. It was 7, 6 kingdoms remade by conquest, carrying new gods and new crowns, and one kingdom standing apart, still keeping faith with a world that no longer entirely existed anywhere else. No one alive then called it the world before the throne. There was no throne yet to be before. There was only a fractured, exhausted continent that had twice been remade by outsiders arriving from across a sea, once by something that nearly ended it, and once by someone who simply wanted to own what remained. It would be a very long time before anyone tried to hold all 7 of those broken pieces in a single hand. Long enough that the memory of the long night would fade into something the Night's Watch alone still took seriously, and the divided, war-scarred kingdoms it left behind would look, to anyone patient enough and ambitious enough, like exactly the kind of world worth uniting. That conqueror was not born yet. His dragons were not born yet either. But the world he would one day try to claim, divided into 7 pieces, still healing from 2 invasions no one living had asked for, was already waiting for him.